And we want to welcome everybody who's joining in online, on demand, wherever you are, whenever you're listening. Man, we're just glad you're a part, and thanks for joining in. We have finally arrived at the finale of our series that we've been in called The Rise and Fall of Samson. So if you're just joining us, we've been in this four-part story that is honestly one of the weirdest and wildest accounts in the Bible. If you don't believe me, just stay tuned because it gets weird and wild. If you miss a week or you want to go catch back up on the series, you can always do that on our YouTube channel, our message podcast, or santacruzbible.org anytime, 24/7. So now if you're joining in or new, or maybe you've caught a couple weeks and you're kind of like, yeah, so what is this about? Samson's life is found in the book of Judges. Judges 13 through 16 is actually where we are. Now this is in the Old Testament, which always yields the question, why are we talking about the Old Testament, right? Like this is somebody that lived over 3,000 years ago. What does this have to do with me? You know, that kind of stuff. But what we've seen is the issues in these stories and these texts. A lot of these are issues that we face today because a lot of us deal with unique temptations in our life. A lot of us deal with desires and emotions that can spin out of control. A lot of us struggle with our identity and things like that at times. So we see that these issues are still there. And what's kind of ironic is Samson struggles, as insane as these stories are and as unhinged as he is, we have more in common with him than we like to admit, because some of the struggles that he has are our own struggles. And that's kind of what we see in this. And so what I want to do is I want to recap before we get into the final part of the story, so that those who are maybe joining in or maybe missed a week can kind of piece it all together. I'm gonna move kind of quick because that's a lot of story to cover, but I'm just gonna kind of give you the gist of what this has been about. Samson is this guy who was born with special gifts and kind of a God-given purpose for his life. So before this guy was born, it was declared that Samson was gonna rescue his people, the Israelites, from a very oppressive regime called the Philistines, okay? And that he was meant to rescue them. And one of his gifts was very unusual. It was unusual physical strength, which was an unusual gift to have, but that's what he had, right? And as we've been getting to know Samson, even though he's physically strong, you realize pretty quickly this guy is a slave to desire. If he sees it, he wants it, and he takes it, right? And so there's this weird tension that we've seen over the last few weeks of there's a greater purpose for Samson's life, but his personal desires are really all that he cares about. For example, he has a lifelong vow on his life. There's a series of vows that he's supposed to stay committed to that's kind of linked to his gifts, and he breaks those vows with disregard. Doesn't really care about that. And then the second thing is kind of weird is his relationship with the Philistines in general. Is he's supposed to be against them because they're oppressing his people, but he's very attracted to them, especially the ladies, right? So this is the thing that happens because it's weird because when he does fight against them, it's because of his own personal drama. It's not because of the purpose of his life. It's because of rage, revenge. One time a wedding goes wrong and he ends up killing a whole bunch of them and ends up burning all the Philistines' crops and grain, just like goes on a rage fest and goes crazy. And so that's kind of what it is. But so now they want to find him and kill him because he's a fugitive. But he keeps sneaking back in town because he really prefers those Philistine ladies, right? So it's this really weird story. So finally, one of those ladies he's very smitten with, Delilah, and that's her name, and he's very attracted to her. We don't know what the story is with her, but anyway, so she's brought in by the rulers, and they say, listen, we're ordering you to find out what his secret is. He's strong. We don't know why he's so strong. We can't capture him. We have to find a way to arrest him, and we need you to help us find that way. So she tries to get him to reveal something about himself that would give him away. And so finally, over time, he breaks. And he reveals a secret about himself that part of his lifelong vow, the only part he's never broken, was he's never supposed to cut his hair from birth. Now, can you imagine if you never cut your hair from birth? To me, that's just super gross, right? You know, kind of thing. But I mean, he's got a bunch of braids of hair kind of hanging down. I mean, it must have been something, right? But that was the part of his vow that he hadn't broken yet. But he tells her about it because really he doesn't care. Because in all honesty, look, it doesn't matter if you cut my hair, the Philistines can't capture me, okay? And here's what I know about me. No matter what I do, God always bails me out. No matter what I do, you know, I'm God's special boy and he's gonna bail me out every time and I'm not worried about it. I kind of do what I want, right? So he doesn't care about this. He kind of sets his own trap out of arrogance. So what happens last week is this disregard for what God has given him and his recklessness finally catch up with him. And his last part of the vow is broken when he's asleep. Delilah has the braids of hair shaved off from him. And again, and then when he wakes up, he has no strength anymore. What that is again, God is not gonna bail him out of this one. And it's not because of the haircut, it's because everything, this life that God meant for him, he has just had no regard for it all. And so finally, God just doesn't bail him out. So what happens is the Philistines move in on him now that he's weak, and they capture him. And this is a gory detail, but it's actually important to this week. They gouge out his eyes. They gouge out his eyes, and then they send him to prison to just walk around in a circle and grind grain for the rest of his life. And that's where we left off last week. And now, I know you hear all this and go, that is a crazy story right there. It really does seem insane. It is a story, though, of extremes. I want you to understand that. What you see in these stories and why they're so what they are is when people are out of control, and when you're driven by rage and what you want and you'll do anything at any cost, we do unthinkable things. And that's what this story is. It's just out of control and just the unthinkable happens. And so it seems like the end of the story. You feel like, well, I don't really know what's left for old Samson if he's in jail and he doesn't have eyes. Like, this doesn't sound great. But what we saw as Judges 16:22 told us, kind of ominously, that before long, his hair began to grow back. And what's interesting here is I want you to understand there's a really big misconception about this story that his hair is magical, like that My Little Pony or something, he just whips it and there's like glitter and things and it's just this magic hair or something like a lasso or Wonder Woman. It just doesn't no, that's not what his hair does, okay? His hair is not magical at all. It's just a final symbol of the life that God meant for him. And so that's what it always was this one thing that, so now that it's gone, he's grinding the grain, walking in circle after circle after circle in complete darkness. But as he feels his head, he can feel his hair growing back. And now the hair is a different symbol. The hair is a symbol of a growing hope. That even though his enemies have completely exploited his recklessness and it seems like they've won and now he's in a prison, he has no chance of escaping at all. This hair growing back, this symbol coming back into his life of what he was supposed to do with his life. He starts thinking, well, I'm still alive. And maybe there's a reason I'm not dead. And maybe, just maybe, there's gonna be one last opportunity for me to live out the purpose that I was meant to live. Maybe. I don't know how, it doesn't seem likely at all. But maybe there'll come a day. And that is where we pick up this week. Judges 16, verse 23. The Philistine rulers held a great festival, offering sacrifices and praising their god Dagon. And they said, our God has given us victory over our enemy Samson. And when the people saw him, talking about Samson, they praised their God, saying, our God has delivered our enemy to us. The one who killed so many of us is now in our power. Half drunk by now, the people demanded, bring out Samson so he can amuse us. And so he was brought from the prison to amuse them, and they had him stand between the pillars supporting the roof. And Samson said to the young servant who was leading him by the hand, place my hands against the pillars that hold up the temple. I want to rest against them. And now the temple was completely filled with people. All the Philistine rulers were there, and there were about 3,000 men and women on the roof who were watching as Samson amused them. So let's back up before this gets out of control yet again. The national god of the Philistines was the god Dagon. Kind of looked like just a guy, right? And it was a god of prosperity and fertility for crops and grain, which you might want to have when you have some dude who burned down all your crops and grain. So when Samson did that, it's kind of a thumb in the nose of their national god of like, yeah, let's see if he's going to help you out here, right? So this is a big celebration and probably what we would call in modern times an arena. Okay, so there's thousands in attendance. The scripture tells us that in the roof seating alone, there's 3,000 people. This place is packed. All of the Philistine rulers are here. This is a who's who. This is a red carpet, right? This is everybody's there. And I kind of wondered as I read this, I'm like, I wonder if there was a guest of honor named Delilah in the VIP section, right? And they're like, and we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for, like that kind of thing. And she kind of stands up and everybody cheers, right? And it's just that kind of a thing, right? Maybe I imagine this too much. I'm hearing like people yelling for hot dogs and cold beer and all. I'm just feeling the arena right now. This is just what happened. And apparently there was a lot of something, because all we do know is this is a huge event and there's a lot of wine and a lot of alcohol going around. And because, when you got that many people in a room half drunk, what could go wrong, right? Kind of a thing, And so what happens is, so it's a big party. This is a rager going on here. And what's interesting to me is that people are celebrating their victory over Samson. This was part of Dagon worship, okay? So this is a weird thing they would do, is that it was declaring the superiority of Dagon. For example, later in the Bible, when King Saul dies, they bring his head and stick it on the wall of the temple of Dagon. And it was their way of saying, Dagon is superior. And there's the other king's head. It was just this big thing they did. So in the spirit of all this superiority, that's why Samson is brought out as the entertainment. Now we're going to get amused. Now we're going to come out and look at this guy who thought he was going to take us out. Look at this guy who they said was going to rescue the Israelite. Let's all bring him out right now and we're going to have a great time. So Samson's let out and he's mocked by a massive crowd of people. He can't see anything, but he can hear them, and it has to be deafening. Just the cheers and the screams and all that stuff. And his hands are placed on the pillars supporting the temple. So verse 28, then Samson prayed to the Lord, sovereign Lord, remember me again. Oh God, please strengthen me just one more time. With one blow, let me pay back the Philistines for the loss of my 2 eyes. And then Samson put his hands on the 2 center pillars that held up the temple, and pushing against them with both hands, he prayed, let me die with the Philistines. Now let's pause before we see what happens here, because this is an interesting scene that Samson's now pushing, and they're all like, oh, they have to be loving this, right? They're all just laughing like, are you kidding me? Look at this guy. He's just, what a joke, right? And Samson prays. Well, I love his prayer because never was the only time we see him pray. Not to say that he didn't pray, but it's important that we do see him here. And he says, God, remember me. Just give me one more chance. Just give me one more chance. And he asked God for the strength to break these pillars, knowing that if he does that, the entire arena implodes. He's going to die. There's no way he'll escape. He knows, I'll die if I do this. And it's kind of still the Samson we all know and love, because he still prays out of revenge, right? Help me do this because they took my eye. It's just the same Samson. But he also knows this is probably the closest he'll ever come to the purpose he was actually meant for. And it's this interesting dilemma in this situation, in that he was meant to rescue the Israelites from the Philistines. And while he cannot be the leader he was called to be, he can be the wrecking ball he has always been. Verse 30. So he's pushing and praying, and the temple crashed down on the Philistine rulers and all the people. So he killed more people when he died than he had during his entire lifetime. What an epitaph right there, right? Like that is something, right? Like the last words about his life is just, he took more people out when he died than he did when he lived. And I'm gonna be honest with you, there's not a lot of history that ends with, and everyone died, right? Definitely been some moments, very rare. Very rare this happened, but that's what happened. I mean, what's interesting about this, Samson had one last shot to save the people that he was meant to save. And he took his last shot in his own way of doing it. And in doing so, people were freed. It's interesting because I went and looked back, because all I can hear is like, I just feel like if they did this in a movie, like you would see it all collapsing and people falling, and you would hear Frank Sinatra's My Way playing in the side. I don't know, for some reason, that's just how I visualize it if I did it, right? Because he did it his way. Like, it's just like, this is how it's gonna happen. And it's interesting to me, when I look back, he actually did free his people from the tyranny of the Philistine Empire, because all the rulers were in that arena and most of the Philistines. So he changed the whole landscape. He changed, the oppressive regime was over pretty quickly. Doesn't mean the Philistines were over, because they later come back against a guy named David. And they have a hero named Goliath, and that's a whole story for another time. But he ends this tyranny. It's the craziest story. I told you that this story had a dramatic finish, and I can't think of anything more dramatic than everyone died. That's I hate when movies end that way. That drives me absolutely crazy. But it does happen in the story. And it's interesting that when everything looked like it was over, what I love about the story is everything looked like it was over and just far too gone, and Samson's blown it. God gives him one more opportunity to save his people, to end the oppression, and give Samson some much needed redemption. What's so interesting about Samson in the end is, get this, we've watched the story. Samson struggled his entire life to be free from his vices. But in the end, he left behind freedom for an entire nation of people. What's interesting to me is he left behind a legacy that was actually greater than the life that he lived. Now, that's Samson. I want to talk about our lives for a second. Because all of us leave behind a legacy. As you think about, what will you leave behind? What will be your legacy? How will people remember the life you lived? What are you going to leave behind for the future? And interesting to me is, if you're still alive, which I assume you are watching this, if you're still alive, is it too late to change what your legacy will be? Now, if those questions weren't uncomfortable enough, allow me to turn it up 10 here and ask you this, okay? And I want you to really hear this question. If God gave you one more opportunity to change the legacy that you leave behind, would you take it? If God gave you an opportunity to directly impact your family in the future, or just directly impact those who knew you in the future, to directly impact what your family name carries with it, if certain things could die with you and no one would go through them, if you could truly leave behind a world better than what you found, would you do it? And that's the kind of questions I like to think about. The good news is, if you woke up today and you're breathing and you are alive, you have that opportunity. You have that opportunity now. And if what we do in life echoes through those who knew us, our kids, grandkids, if you have those, just the next generation, you need to hear this. You still have a chance to leave behind a legacy greater than the life that you lived. What needs to carry on and continue when you're gone? What needs to start now so that it will go into the future? And I want you to understand that it is not too late. And by the way, I'm not selling you a will or life insurance, okay? I need to be very upfront about that because I think every time someone tells you this, they're like, now let's talk about term life. Or like, I'm not, none of that, okay? So, but before I talk about this on a personal level and kind of like the things that I've kind of wrestled with on this, before I do, I want to thank some people who in my opinion, really live this out. There are people in this room watching online right now or listening whenever you're listening who are over 70 years old. And if you're over 70 years old, you're experiencing a world that is less and less like what you knew almost every day. The nation has been shifting and changing in dramatic ways. It's hard to keep up, right? The pandemic accelerated that change. Santa Cruz itself is changing. It's not a sleepy beach town, right? People say that, and I'm just like, do you live here, right? It's a growing city with new people, new challenges moving into it every single day. Everything around you is changing and changing so quickly. So on top of all that change, if you've been at Santa Cruz Bible Church, you've been through, I don't know, a couple changes, right? couple things have happened, right? In the last, decades or whatnot. And I want you to know that if you're here, maybe if you're under 70, you don't know this, people who are here who are over 70 have hung with me and our staff through some transitions and because they've really made a decision. I want to talk about the decision they've made. And it's been healthy transitions, but hard transitions. And it's hard because many of them would love to have a church that we did hymns and we did verse by verse teaching and we did a lot more throwbacks to what seems like a simpler time. But more than that, they would rather have a church that reaches their kids and their grandkids. And instead of having a church catered to them, which you could have, they would rather have a church that outlives them and carries on into the future. And they have chosen, well, the first message that I ever did here, I talked about the difference between purpose and preference. And they've chosen the purpose of the church over their preferences, and they don't groan when they see younger people come in. They get excited. And instead of being afraid of the future, which we all could be, a lot of them, their mentality has been, hey, here I am, Lord, send me. I would like to make a difference in these later chapters in my life. I want to be a part of not building a museum to the past. I want to be a part of building a church that's going to go into the future. And I want to help be a part of that. And for those people who've done that, I think not only should we thank them, but we should applaud them and thank them for everything they've done. And I want to, in all seriousness, thank you for your example. I think about Psalm 78 when I think about this. It says, we will not hide these truths from our children. We will tell the next generation about the glorious deeds of the Lord, about his power and his mighty wonders. So each generation should set its hope anew on God, not forgetting his glorious miracles and obeying his commands. And I want to thank you for your example, and I pray that we in younger generations will do the same. Later, when we realize like, oh man, I'm gonna have to, this isn't about me anymore. I'm gonna have to, this is gonna be about them, and I've got to reshuffle and reposition myself. And for every one of you, thank you. I think about this, the Apostle Paul said this about this young pastor he was mentoring. His name was Timothy. And he was talking about his life, and he said in 2 Timothy 1:5, he said, I remember your genuine faith, for you share the faith that first filled your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. And I know that same faith continues strong in you. And what Paul was telling him is he said, you come from a legacy of faith. Your grandmother had strong faith. Your mother had strong faith. And I'm praying that that legacy of faith continues in you. And everybody knows that when you have a legacy of faith in your family, every once in a while you have the rebellion, the runaway, the I'm not doing this, all that kind of stuff. That stuff happens. But I'm telling you that when it comes back down to it, that legacy of faith is the basis of everything for your family. I mean, and I want to encourage you that if you want your kids or grandkids or those who know you after you're gone to have a strong faith, show them what strong faith looks like now. If you want your kids and your grandkids and those in you to seek God for wisdom, show them what that looks like. You know, one thing I'll bring up, it's just that a lot of times people have told me, like, I really want my kids and my grandkids to be generous. You need to show them what generosity, I mean, we talk about generosity a lot of times, the legacy and things like that. Show them what generosity looks like. That's why I tell people when you give, which we always encourage you to do that. And again, if you don't like me, give somewhere else, okay? But give, okay? That's the point, right? You're like, I'm not paying for his, shoes or whatever. I got it. So anyway, but the whole thing is, I encourage you to give and be generous, but I encourage you to talk about that with your family because your kids need to understand, hey guys, these are things we support. There is a food pantry every week, hundreds of people. One day we're gonna drive by there. I want you to see all those people. We give toward that. We help keep that going. We support, all the things that you talk about and support, our church or this and that, they need to hear and understand that we don't keep everything. I don't want you to be materialistic and just keep it all and burn it for yourself. You need to give some stuff away, and we need to show them things like that. That's what a legacy of faith. And I want you to understand, regardless of what the topic is, I want my kids to be kind, show them what that kindness looks like. We still choose what we leave behind. But I want to bring up something. This is the personal part for me. You can still choose what you leave behind, but please do so before it is too late. I want to show you something. I want to tell you the story behind this. This is a tape recorder that I bought in the summer of 2000, okay? And I want to tell you why I bought this. During that summer, I was finishing college, and I was working, and about 2 hours away from me, I was living in Tennessee at the time, and my dad contracted 3 types of cancer. He was already a cancer survivor, but this time he got 3 types. Well, he went in, wasn't feeling well, and they were like, you've got lymphoma, melanoma, a number of things. So every few days, while I was trying to finish college and trying to work as a youth pastor or whatever I was doing at the time, I would drive back and try to spend weekends with him and just try to spend time with him. And eventually the doctors told us, they said, listen, when this cancer, it's aggressive, when it moves into his brain, that's when he's gonna die. Because we were trying to there's so much going on, how will we know? This is how you'll know. So the next week, knowing that now I don't know when this is gonna happen, but it sounds like it could be weeks, months, soon, we don't know. I bought this tape recorder. And I wanted to record conversations with my dad that I could play for my future wife, my future kids. I just thought this was this really great idea. So later that week, I drove into town and I told him what I wanted to do, and I set the tape recorder and I hit record and we started talking. And as we were talking, I quickly noticed he didn't look well. He looked worse than I'd seen him. And he started saying really strange things. And he was intense, and then he was non-intense, and his trains of thought weren't really going anywhere, and something was wrong. So I stopped the recorder. And then I didn't really know who to call. And I called my pastor at the time. He knew the situation about my dad, and I didn't know who to call. And I just called him, and he said, listen, I'm gonna come there right now. And so he came over, and while I waited outside, he talked to my dad. And he came back out to me, and he put his arm around me, and he just said, Matt, that's not your dad anymore. And he's alive, but he's gone. The cancer has moved in, and he can't think straight, he can't talk straight anymore, and I'm so sorry. And he just sat there with me, and I just wept. I was 20 years old. I just wept my eyes out, and I just was so upset because there was nothing I could do, and I didn't, I just didn't know when it would happen. And as I'm driving off, I was crying in the car, as you can imagine, and I was just so upset. And I popped open this tape recorder, and I took the tape out of it, and I threw it out of the car window because I never wanted to hear what I had heard. And I bring up this story because I wanted something that I could carry on. But I left with an empty tape recorder. Now, the Lord took care of me. I want you to know that when I married my wife, Carrie, I joined a family of pastors. She vowed she'd never marry a pastor. And we all know how that works out, right? And so, yeah, and actually, I looked like a drummer. I was drumming when she saw me, so I kind of faked her out. Anyway, I used the whole drummers are hot thing and then moved in. I'm like, I'm a pastor, got that bait and switch. Anyway, so, but no, when I married her, I mean, her dad is a pastor. He came from a legacy of pastors, and there was such a legacy of strong faith in her family. But I got to kind of be grafted into a legacy that wasn't really mine, but I was allowed in. But I keep this recorder in my desk, and I've kept it all these years because no matter what I do in this life, successful or not successful, that doesn't really matter. What I leave behind for my kids is all they'll have. It's all they'll remember of me. So every once in a while when I open this drawer, I see it, it reminds me of what are you leaving behind? And I bring this up because if you're not sure what your legacy will be, just like Samson, you have another chance. But please don't wait, because there is such a thing as too late. And I don't tell you this to make you sad or scared. I tell you that because it's just the reality of life. I hope that you don't regret not making that phone call or not making that visit or not reconciling when you knew that you could. Don't hang on to your pride, because I don't know about you, but I've been in a lot of funerals, and someday you're going to wish you'd thrown all that away years ago. Holding on to it doesn't mean much in the end. You cannot change what was left behind to you, but you can change what you leave behind. And if you want a legacy of faith and kindness and generosity and wisdom and whatever that it is that you want, then I want to encourage you that God can help you do that today. God can help you navigate those decisions and those things to say, you know what, I don't know when I'm going to be gone. And I'm not, again, trying to spook you or scare you, okay? But we don't know. But I feel like we have an opportunity to make a mark and say, no, this is what I want to leave behind more than anything else. Even if it means a sacrifice for me, I want to set them up to win. I want to set up the next generation. The decisions we make today determine the legacy that we will leave for tomorrow. So I want to ask you, how are you living that out right now? Here's the good news. God has given you an opportunity. The question is, what will you do with it? Let's pray together. Father, we just come to you in this moment, and we thank you for your grace and your mercy, because so often we are so swept up in the everyday of life, just what's happening now, what's happening this week, what's happening on my phone, what's happening in this. And sometimes we forget to think about, what am I leaving behind? And we don't want to come into later chapters of our lives with a lot of regrets, with a lot of what ifs, with a lot of I wish I had. Life is fragile. We never know when some chapters end and some chapters begin, but what we do know is today we have an opportunity to not only trust you in a deeper way, but to have you help us set something forth into the future. If our decisions today determine what we leave behind tomorrow, Father, help us to do that well. I pray that you will show your people who are in this room, watching, listening, wherever they are, show your people, number one, that you love them, that you are there for them, and that you join us and you come alongside us when we plant the seeds today of what we want to see tomorrow. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.